Ait squail muck sweat. Nano tala ellie in a swalloquat on a quail, Aichka. You wenyoch tiwiath san atlas scopthet, Aichka. Cha sal main Aichka, utla hael ait squail. Equal me amastalch a quitla quam squalwin. Dichwam te I amastalch a quitla ait squalwin. Dichwam slachentas te liketh. I la limited sep at the saleluch. Tiwiath tan quaswa kikalis I kaki mstimo. Dichwam slete kunstoch tanat quamach. Tiwiath tan quaswa stathi slete kunze tushtan aften tamach. Dichwam la limitalch te eli na schwala quad and a quail. Ether sweat an schwala qua animate. Heichka quans nan utstli at nimel. Na washquam quamstana sali titles iam atana quail ita mux quail Heichka. The sea. The sea. The sea. The sea. Oh, 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 ay tepka. Like the squalla ones, Kwasiska Kipat Nawa Tanaquel is really good. Brings really good feelings to see each and every one of you here today. as we journey along another episode of Learning with Syeyutsus, the TRC 57 Calls to Action, the series where the Nanaimo Ladysmith public school systems journey towards a greater understanding of truth and reconciliation. Antha Tsamkwatan, Lawrence Tanashquanita Masnesne. We also have our dear Shwakwa, Stephanie Johnson, as well here, and our CM Shwakwa, Sheila Carr-Stewart. We send our heartfelt Shkwalawans out to our dear relative Ted Cadwallader, who couldn't be here today, but he sends his regards. He looked Tanashkwalawans Zethlamet the CM Sheila Carr-Stewart. It really gives us good feelings and happiness to listen to Sheila Carr-Stewart here, who is a professor emerita at the College of Education at the University of Saskatchewan. She also teaches in the Faculty of Education at the University of Alberta. She is a former teacher and has worked extensively in the area of Indigenous education, particularly on issues related to jurisdiction, administration, funding, and local control of community schools. In 2013, she received the University of Saskatchewan Provost's Award for Teaching and Research Excellence in Aboriginal Education. Thank you so much for being here and joining us today, and we look forward to all of the gifts that you have to share with us.
Thank you. So I would like to thank everyone for inviting me to present today. I'm really glad that I watched Marie Battiste's presentation last week because Marie and I both taught in, or both were involved in education in Nova Scotia back in the late 1970s. So tells you I've been around for a while. And we also both taught at the University of Saskatchewan. So Marie's friendship gives me guidance to present here today. So I am a non-Indigenous person. I am a settler. I was a teenager when my parents moved with my sisters and I to Canada. I completed high school in Montreal, went to MacDonald College, and then went on to do master's and completed my PhD here at the University of Alberta. So as a teenager, we lived close to Ganawaki Reserve, which is south of the island of Montreal. And my interest in Indigenous education was opened and captured. I moved to New Brunswick and taught on the Elitsi Buktuk First Nation, used to be called Big Cove. And from then on, my studies and research and commitments have been focused on Indigenous historical and current matters. I am particularly interested in the numbered treaties and the treaty right to education. I research and write on this topic and have supported First Nations in their legal battles. Today's presentation, and it's interesting because I was conducting research with another fellow researcher at the National Archives in Ottawa. And actually, we were trying to find out research and if Indian Affairs was involved in the kindergarten focus in the early 1900s. Kindergarten was quite a big movement in the 1900s. Well, alas, my fellow researcher and I found out nothing. So it was, we didn't end up writing anything because we couldn't find anything. But while researching, I found letters relating to Chief Thunderchild from Prime Minister MacDonald, from Roman Catholic bishops and Indian agents. And this is the research that leads to this chapter in my book, One School for Every Reserve, Chief Thunderchild's Defense of Treaty Rights and Resistance to Separate Schools from 1880 to 1925. And as we go through this, I will hope you will see all the issues that individuals had to deal with and work towards. So we have the presentation. I think you're going to be able to see it. So we're looking at just one community. This search is about the struggle of Chief Thunderchild, who was the leader of the Thunderchild Reserve and that is in the present day Saskatchewan. So it's just, it's not really in the north of Saskatchewan, but it is really from about the middle of Saskatchewan north. And Chief Thunderchild believed in school communities. And it's really interesting because we're talking more than almost 150 years ago. And he really believed in school communities. And that's what he wanted to build. One school to pursue Western education while maintaining their own culture, language, and spirituality. So when we asked then, well, what were the issues and the conflicts he had in trying to have a school on his reserve? So we have to start asking the following questions. Who has the authority to build and operate on First Nation reserves in the 19th century? And when you look at that question, it's an easy question to ask, but then you have to know, we have to look at all the issues that come into place. We look at Treaty 6, which was signed in 1876, and that's Treaty 6 covers the middle of present day Saskatchewan and Alberta. So it's the reserve that, or it's the treaty that Chief Thunderchild adhered to. And then we have the Indian Act, we have the British North American Act and the Constitution, the rights in the Chief and Council, the Prime Minister and all, because here is a small reserve and you can see John A. MacDonald writing letters. So it becomes a much bigger issue than you think it is at first. And Canada's looking at the most efficient means of providing education. And we're looking at the 1880s, you know what's going to come up, the conflict of day schools versus boarding schools or residential schools. This is the area that this school, that the chief wants on Thunderchild Reserve is located in. Non-First Nations people we know were attending provincial schools, and they had the right to choose their own denominational school, Roman Catholic or Protestant. This is a part of their culture. They had that right, and you're going to see how that becomes ultimately a part of this story about Chief Thunderchild. And this is Chief Thunderchild. Taken in 1920, he subsequently died in 1927. The circle right in the middle of his jacket is his treaty medal. So when he had adhered to Treaty 6, that medal was given to him as it was to all the other chiefs that signed Treaty 6. So Chief Thunderchild, who is he? Well, he's a Plains Cree. He lived from 1849 to 1927, and he lived in present-day Saskatchewan. But he was like Big Bear. Chief Thunderchild resisted signing Treaty 6 in 1876. He says, what is $5 a head for this mighty land? So here's the federal government or the treaty commissioners offering them $5. And he said, you do not respect the land. So he refused to sign in 1876. But by 1879, he really had no choice. There are no buffalo left on theirs in the countryside. He went all the way down to Montana and they never caught any buffalo. So the Europeans had killed the buffalo so the fur could go back to Europe. And when he started to look for food to eat from the government, who was settling in and around what is today's Saskatchewan, the Indian Commissioner Dooney said only allowed food to be given to those who had signed treaty. So there's no food left unless you sign treaty, you're not going to get anything from the government. So Chief Thunderchild and his people, and there were 30 families in this tribe, adhered to Treaty 6. In 1880, they settled on their first reserve near Battleford. And I use the first because we're not going to get into it at all, but they were ultimately forced to move from this reserve. But the first reserve they settled on, they ultimately did a really good job in settling on the land. So the Indian Act in 1876 says The term reserve means any tract or tracts of land set apart by treaty. So if you had signed treaty, you were going to get a piece of land which would become your home for the use and benefit of or granted to a particular band of Indians, of which the legal title is in the crown. So once you signed, you were going to get a piece of land, and that land belonged to the crown. So when we're looking at all of these rules, they're really coming from the 1876 Indian Act. And there is no research that anybody has ever found that the people of Treaty 6 or Treaty 7, which was signed in 1877, knew about the Indian Act. They certainly were not told that at the treaty meetings. So the initial people that signed treaty were not aware that Indian Affairs was also creating the Indian Act. So in Section 11 of the Indian Act, no person or Indian other than an Indian of the band shall settle, reside, or hunt upon or occupy any use of the land. So once you've created a First Nations reserve and the land that they're given as theirs, no other person can come on the reserve. So not a white person and not another First Nations from another reserve. That reserve is totally, as it says in Section 11 in 1876, is resided only for the people of that one band. In Section 63, the Chief in Council may, subject to confirmation by the Governing Council, set rules and regulations. And the only rule and regulations that the Chief and Council have in 1876 is the construction and repair of school houses. So it always, creates this issue. Why did the government think that First Nations were going to be able to construct and build schools? You got to have a lot of money to build schools in this time. But that's the only power that the chiefs had, was construct or repair school houses. So Chief Thunderchild was confirmed by the government of Canada as the chief of the Thunderchild First Nation. Thunderchild wanted his people to accept the necessity of change and to adapt to it without losing their identity as Indians. So they wanted the two to come together, to stay who you are as a First Nations person, but also to be able to learn to keep up with the change in economy. And in the 1870s and the 1880s, the land is changing very quickly. It's no longer land that you can hunt. There's no fur animals left, but there are lots of settlers coming and farming. A decade later, the reserve was identified as having good soil and wood with hay lands, crops, and houses recently erected between neat structures having wooden floors and windows. So you get this idea that the people of Thunderchild were determined to create a new life. They were really good farmers. They looked after the land and they built homes for their people. And what we can really say about Chief Thunderchild was he really knew his entitlements under Treaty 6. He has sat through all the negotiations for Treaty 6, initially said no, then came back 3 years, but he knew what the treaty said and he knew about the Indian Act. He and his community worked hard, had good land and farmed it effectively. He recognized the need for change and he wanted his people to live in two worlds. So we talk about this today. Here is a chief and his people saying they wanted two worlds. They wanted to say who they were, stay who they were as First Nations people, but they wanted to be able to participate in the new world around them. So he said he wanted one school on the reserve, and that is coming from the treaty. He went to the treaty meetings and the treaty commissioners promised them that he could have her school. His people would get a school. Chief Thunderchild knew the treaty was signed in 1876, and what did it say? Majesty, and we're talking about Queen Victoria, agrees to maintain schools for instruction in such reserves hereby made as to her government of the Dominion of Canada may seem advisable whenever the Indians of the reserve shall desire it. So here he's asking for what is in the treaties, the commitment that the commissioners said, when you want a school and you ask for it, we will give you a school. So here are the people living and farming on their first reserve and doing really well. And the Church of England comes along. The Church of England, this is what was coming in the 1870s and the 80s. It's today the Anglican Church, but at this point it's the Church of England. And they approached the Chief Thunderchild and asked to be able to establish a school on the reserve. So Chief Thunderchild knew that he wanted a school. The first people that came with the Church of England, they asked, the Chief and Council got together, and they agreed that they could put a school on the reserve. So the chiefs and headmen across the West did not associate education with Catholicism or Protestantism. So when you look at Thunderchild, they had been on the land looking for buffalo. We know that between 1876 and 1879. So now, just a few years later, somebody's asking them to put a school on there. So the treaty discussions simply focused on school. There's no discussions talking about the treaty discussions. There's no evidence anywhere that you were going to choose a Catholic school or a Protestant school. The commitment is to build a school on the reserve. In October 1885, the Church of England Day School began operating on the Thunderchild Reserve. So here we are in 1885, getting one school built on the First Nations Reserve. A schoolhouse was opened up on the Thunderchild Reserve in October 1885 under the auspices of the Church Missionary Society, and that's an adjunct of the Church of England. The teacher was John Hope, and he was referred to him as a native teacher. When you look at the history in Alberta and Saskatchewan, a lot of people are referred as native teachers. These are teachers who are Aboriginal people from Ontario. They had gained education in the schools in Ontario, and they came out west to teach, particularly in Saskatchewan and Alberta. Once you have a school and the school's operating for a year, Indian Affairs would give them $300 annually to pay for the teacher. So $300, when you look at it, well, was that good or bad? Well, when you look at it, the province is giving between $600 and $700 per teacher to teach. That's what the province and colonial schools were doing at the time. So here right away, we see that any teacher teaching on the reserve only gets paid $300. So when you put that in today's context, we know that continually we're fighting for First Nations teachers today to be paid at least equal to provincial schools. And you can see this being limited in teacher salary goes way back to 1885. So here was John Hope teaching 29 students in the school. The school was supplied with comfortable desks and seats and a cupboard and a table where all slates and books can be put away when school closes. Where did the furniture come from? It came from the Battleford Indian Industrial School. So this industrial school is pretty close to where the Thunderchild Reserve is. They made the furniture which came to the school. The instruction was in writing, arithmetic, grammar, geography, history, music and singing, drawing, knitting, and woodworking. And we could all question how much people actually learned in those, but that's really not the focus of this. But they had some general information. And one individual, John Hope, is teaching all of the children in the school. So the community school was maintained by the community. So here is Indian Affairs has given the chief and council responsibility for maintaining the school community. In 1894, when we look into the annual review of Indian Affairs, we can see that the school at Thunderchild, the building was willowed and plastered on the outside and on the inside. So commitment by the people to maintain that school. In 1895, the following year, it said the building is in good repair and school material plentiful. So they were committed to the school, they kept it clean, they had the materials. They built fences, they did the repairs, they provided this supply of fuel, and all were provided by the band. So Chief Thunderchild's involvement in the school, we know he was involved. He was present at the school. He took quite an interest in the proceedings. These are what we can find out from the annual report of Indian Affairs. In 1896, Chief Thunderchild attended the examination of pupils and was much interested in the exercises. 2 of his own children attended the school. So we see this Protestants, we see this school maintained by the Church of England and operating on the school. But if you know your history from the late 1800s, and you could still argue today that the people, it was viewed as a Protestant school because the Church of England had asked for it to build. And once we have that, now we get the Catholic Church coming into play in this conflict about school on the Thunderchild Reserve. So the Roman Catholic Church wanted and intended to establish a school at Thunderchild First Nation. So here's a nation, has 30 families. They're all at this point about anywhere from about 20 to 29 children attending this Protestant school. Now they're going to have a Catholic school. The First Nation hasn't asked for 2 schools. They're just content with having 1 school. It raises these issues. The settlers established 2 schools in the Northwest Territory communities. They established Roman Catholic and Protestant. And I know you know where this is going to go. The reserve school is for First Nations people, but it must follow this, must it follow the settlers? We would like to argue no, but you're going to see how that comes out. At the treaty discussions, First Nations were assured that the treaty would not lead to any forced interference with their mode of life. We know that from the annual report of Indian Affairs. They're saying nobody's going to interfere in your life. You've got 1 school, but you're going to see how Indian Affairs changes its time over the next year or so. Chief Thunderchild believed that a single school would keep the community together, allow adults and children to learn new skills and participate in the new economy. Early schools provided education for all ages. So we know that there was up to about 30 children attending the school, but parents were also provided education through the school. That 1 school provided a variety of assistance to the women to learn how to cook and sew, and the men, and how to try to read. When we start to get these issues of the Protestants and the Catholic beginning to now argue about having 2 schools on the reserve, you can see how issues are going to come up. We know that when he first started, the teacher at the school, he obviously was Anglican, but he made the commitment not to teach any religious topics, that the children in the school were simply going to be provided Western education. So between the 1880s to the 1900s, we're going to get the 2 churches really involved in this school. And it's a little school and only has 30 kids. And all of a sudden, we're going to get a variety of people participating in this. We get Chief Thunderchild and his band members. You can find writing from the Battleford Indian agent. There are letters from Hayter, who is the Indian commissioner in Ottawa. We get letters from the Superintendent of Indian Affairs in Ottawa. There are letters from Prime Minister John A. MacDonald. There's letters from the Roman Catholic father, from the Bishop of St. Albert, from the Archbishop in Winnipeg, and from the Church Missionary Society, the Church of England. So you can see everybody getting involved in this conflict. So Thunderchild and the Indian agent, the letter of July the 12th, 1889, to the chief. The chief sent for me, who's the Indian agent, and he said to go to the reserve and stop Father Cochon from starting a school on the reserve. So here's the chief saying to the Indian agent, you come to the reserve. We want to stop this second school. So he went to the reserve, and sometimes not much different from today, everybody meets in the schoolhouse. So the Indians had all assembled in the schoolhouse. The chief spoke and said that Father Cochon had taken possession of a house on the reserve and was putting it in shape to teach school. If you remember a few slides ago, we talked about the only people legally able to be on the reserve are the First Nations people from that reserve. You can be another First Nations person, you can be a non-First Nations person, you can be white or whatever, but you can't just go on to the reserve. So here, and Chief Thunderchild knows his rights, he's knows what's in the Indian Act and in the treaty. And here he is with the chief taking over somebody's house and saying that they're going to make that into a Catholic school. So the chief said that the priest asked to have a school before the Protestant one had been established. So what the chief says, well, the Protestants asked to build a school and we said yes. Now all of a sudden they want a second school, or the father wants a second school. But now that a school was in operation, they did not want a second school. If the Catholics had asked first, they would have given it to the Catholics, but they only want one school on the reserve. And they're stating that they understood that reserve was for the Indians, and unless they wished it, no one should infringe on their property. So coming out, and these are all from letters from the 1890s and the early from the 1890s and the early 1900s, and these people knew what their rights were. Chief Thunderchild was particularly concerned with maintaining Creek culture and spirituality and a cohesive community. As his people had done prior to entering into treaty, he wanted that life to continue. He believed that a single school on the reserve would keep the community together and at the same time assist both agents and children to learn new skills and participate in the new economy. The teacher at the school, who we know was Protestant, did not provide any religious topics readings to ensure that Roman Catholics and Protestants were not interfered with in their religion. So religion and the schools. And Father Cochon, the Roman Catholic priest, says, I have warned the other Catholics to withdraw their children from the Protestant school. I have told them that their duty as a Catholic was to take their young from the school, and that my duty as a priest was able to compel him to do so as soon as possible. So when you think about this, these people had only just moved to the reserve. Until they moved to the reserve, they had been First Nations who were used to traveling down across what is now Canada and the United States, but they would travel that way looking for buffalo to hunt to feed people, and they had only come back and settled here since 1879, but they don't have much knowledge of religious issues, and Catholics and Protestants not mentioned at the treaty meetings whatsoever. So the Indian Commissioner wrote to the Roman Catholic Church. In 1889, the letter to Bishop Grandin from the Indian Commissioner. So here's the guy in Ottawa writing a letter to Bishop Grandin. One of your missionaries at Battleford has commenced the erection of a church and a school on Thunderchild's Reserve, and it is reported to me against the open opposition of the majority of the band and without the sanction of the Superintendent General. So nobody in Ottawa had given any authority for this. It was strictly the priest asking for this to be done. Under the privileges granted to them by treaty, the department is bound to recognize their wishes. So here for a while, we have Indian Affairs actually coming out initially and supporting Chief Thunderchild. In the case in question, establishing a Catholic school on Thunderchild's Reserve, it is observed that the proposal is contrary to the wishes of the chief and the majority of the band. And therefore, it cannot be seen that the department would be doing right, or that it would have any authority to authorize the establishment of a church or a school on the reserve without the consent of the Indians. So we see here in this area that initially Indian Affairs is supporting Chief Thunderchild and his people. Indian Affairs writes, Chief Thunderchild tries all he can to unite his Indians. The chief and followers are determined to resist a second school on the reserve by force. They may let him, the priest, build off the reserve, but not on the reserve. The attempt to build a Roman Catholic school resulted in the Roman Catholic school, which was a house, being ruined by fire. So here we get the first Roman Catholic school being burned down. We get a second school, Roman Catholic school, burnt, and that one burns down also. So there's no knowledge in materials of who set fire to the school. There's none in any of the history books. When I spoke with people at Thunderchild, they can tell you who did actually burn down the school, but it is none of the people that we are looking at. A letter from the Bishop of St. Albert to Hayter Reid says, it appears that the famous Thunderchild has for the second time destroyed the Catholic school erected on his reserve. The chief has, as in the first instance, destroyed this building without any other reason than to show his opposition to the Catholic school. So we know for sure that the chief did not burn this down, but that makes no difference whatsoever to the Catholic Church. So Hayter Reid, who's the Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs in Ottawa, writes to the Bishop of St. Albert, without in any way desiring to minimize the gravity of the offense, 2 schools burnt down, I must point out that Chief Thunderchild was convinced from his understanding of the treaty stipulations that he was vindicating his rights in resisting the establishment of a second school on the reserve. So with all of this going on, if you had children, would you send your children to that school? And probably not. And I can see head shaking, and I would shake mine too. The conflict over the school had widespread effect on the community of Thunderchild. And there's 2 quotes. I don't really want you to look at the numbers on the next 2 sheets, but there are 2 sheets in this presentation. But if you look just in the first 2 or 3 lines, we get 18 children attending. If you look in 1990, there's 19 children attending. If you look on the second page and you look to the very end, we only have 3 or 4 or 5 children attending. So, you know, if you only have those few amounts of children, you can't maintain the school. So the actual school on Thunderchild closes down. A second school, a Roman Catholic boarding and residential school, was built close to the Thunderchild Reserve. So Here is the closure of the day school on Thunderchild Reserve, and a little, just a short distance from Thunderchild is residential school. And why the government originally supports Thunderchild, you see that now changing, and you can read in this document how it is changing. Under no pretext are any of the government officials to insist on the Indians sending their children to a school where their religious faith will be imperialed or respected, and that the Catholic missionaries shall be at liberty to exercise their ecclesiastical functions whenever they see the missionaries are in no way interfered with. It is the aim of the department to allow both Protestant and Catholic missionaries as much freedom in the exercise of their calling upon the Indians as possible. So right from this, you see now that we're going to get, as John A. MacDonald says, you're only going to get now Catholic schools or Protestants. You can't just have a school for all the people on the reserve. In 1902, on Thunderchild's Reserve, there is a day school conducted by the Church of England. The attendance is small. There is also a boarding school immediately adjoining Thunderchild's Reserve. It's just a short ways up the road, but this is from 1902. It is under the management of the Roman Catholic Church. At present, there is a regular attendance of 15 children from various reserves of the Battleford Agency. I shall be glad when the department authorizes a larger number of pupils at the school, as there are more valuable, as this class of institutions certainly gives a good value for the money expended upon them. So this glorifying the residential schools as being better schools. So the day school at Thunderchild's closed. There's a residential school just a little ways up. The Indian Act was changed. The Indian Act guaranteed now a second school for the minority. And further, Her Majesty agrees to maintain schools for instruction in such reserves hereby made as to our government, the Dominion of Canada, may seem advisable when any of the Indians of the reserve shall desire it. So you now see that schools on the reserves are now going to follow the provincial schools. So are they going to become Catholic or Protestants? Subsequently, the children at Thunderchild attended residential school once it closed in 1902, or they went to a residential school or industrial school, and most of the children at Thunderchild did not go. You can look up and there are no Thunderchild children listed around. So when we look at the chief's comments, he knew that in Treaty 6, Her Majesty agrees to maintain schools whenever the Indians of the reserve shall desire it. Initially, treaty commitments were reiterated by Indian Affairs, but the government chose to ignore the number of treaties. They were left in abeyance. And not until the 1980s. Indian Affairs does not look at treaties until the 1980s. So when they signed them in the, from 1871, once they sign them, and after the 1880s, they just forget about the treaties and they only look at the Indian Act. Indian Act, the Indian Affairs does not provide any educational services under the treaties and uses only the Indian Act. And that is true from once the school was closed at Thunderchild, and it is true today. So when we look at the Indian Act in 1876, the chief or chiefs of any band in council may frame, subject to confirmation by the governing council, rules and regulations. And what can they do? They can construct and repair schoolhouses, council houses, and other Indian public buildings, but they have no authority in the school of their children. So when we look at 1884 and the general provisions, the religious denomination into which the teacher or teachers of the school or schools established on the reserve shall belong as being that of the majority of the Indians residents on the reserve. but the Protestants or Roman Catholic minority on the reserve may also have a separate school. You know, and when you think about this, this is what they're saying in 1884. You have to remember that Chief Thunderchild and his people didn't sign treaty until 1879. 5 years later, they get a school, and then in 1884, you know, all of their desires of having a school, which they believed in and could teach them, and they would go home in the evenings, is totally gone. So Indian Affairs does say you can have a separate school for the minority if you're fortunate. So Indian Act in 1894 comes into place. In Section 137, the Governing Council may make regulations either general or affecting the Indians of any province of any named band. So here he's back making sure you know that Indian Affairs is in control. Earnest attention should be given by agents to the administration of schools, and efforts should be made to increase their efficiency. And the efficiency is they don't want any more day schools. They don't see those providing any benefit. They're only going to support boarding schools. So this is where from 1894, they're going to support boarding schools, and they're going to pay no attention whatsoever. Most of the day schools are going to close down. When we see the Chief and Council, the only power they have, if we're talking about authority, is they can repair the buildings. Indian Affairs residential school policy is implemented throughout Canada from, at this point in time, from Nova Scotia all the way to British Columbia. The Constitution, the two school systems, the majority and the minority religious groups of settlers is going to be applied to First Nations. So I know for a fact that not one of these, and this is the Indian agent speaking, so he's saying, I know for a fact that not one of these Indians at Thunderchild are asking for a second school. One school is all they wanted. There is no difficulty to get the children to go to the Protestant school or to the Catholic school if they had one school. But the trouble is with the priest. I do not want the priest on the reserve. So you can see how they bring out these issues. So the Indian agent says, I must point out that the Chief Thunderchild was convinced from his understanding of the treaty stipulations that he was vindicating his rights in resisting the establishment of a school on his reserve without his consent. And we know when we look at the Indian Act that nobody can go on there unless the First Nations give permission for somebody other than from that band to come on the reserve. He contended that no land could, under treaty stipulations, be taken or occupied on the reserve for such purposes without the permission of the band. So you can't come up and set a Catholic school unless the chief has given his approval. John A. MacDonald, who initially starts out a little favorably, changes that by the end. He is in charge of residential schools. He favors residential schools. The conflict between Protestant and Roman Catholic churches marred in relations to the economy. MacDonald wrote to Reed, the Indians, and he's talking about Thunderchild, were living at peace with one another, and all seemed to work until the present Roman priest, Reverend Mr. Cochin, arrived, and shortly after his arrival, discord seemed to enlarge itself among the Indians until it was gone, so far that the reserve seems to hold two distinct classes of people. And when you look at the people talking, you can't find people disagreeing. The community is pretty strong on only one school. Actually, there's a line in there where one person says, well, maybe we should have two schools because we would get more food. So you can see he's only joking about this, but if they had more people to give food, that might be one reason for having two schools. Catholic and Protestant denomination schooling had been imposed on First Nations. They didn't ask for it. It was imposed by the federal government. The failure of Chief Thunderchild's struggle to maintain his treaty right to have only one school in his community demonstrating not only the power of the federal government over the daily lives of First Nations communities, but also the power of religious groups to create discord in Indigenous communities and establish their own treaties. So you've got the Indian Act and you've got the religious groups that are determined to get their religion on the school and make sure people become either Roman Catholic or Catholic. And I would argue you get people, and 5 years after they moved on to the reserve, you can't convince me they were either Catholic or Protestant. The only reason is the Protestant school came along and said, can we establish a school? And they said yes. So the efforts of Chief Thunderchild and his people to maintain a day school on their reserve as promised in Treaty 6 were secondary to Canada's constitutional guarantee of denominational schooling for settlers' children. So here we can see the colonization of people. You are now going to be made to choose a religion, either Catholic or Protestant. Mandatory attendance for children at residential schools ensured that First Nations children would be educated within the denominational schools without consideration of their parents' wishes. So once you took the children into a residential school, the parents were no longer included. Few of the children at Thunderchild attended school between 1902 and 1927. Some of the children attended the nearby residential school. Ultimately, Chief Thunderchild First Nation petitioned Ottawa with the help of the Roman Catholic bishop to build a new school. And that is what happens at the end. A day school was built in 1927. So for basically 25 years, there's no school and no education. But the Catholic Church does support them and they get a day school in 1927. Chief Thunderchild died in 1927. His demand for strong quality community-based school echoes through Canada today. First Nation schools need education growth and the ability to determine their school programs. And you can see that happening across the countryside, particularly within probably, we will say 1970 because we begin to get band operated school. But you can see from once that closed the school closes in Thunderchild, it just more or less ends and we don't really get any power for education again until 1927. So you see how a group of people, a small community, wanted one school on the reserve. They lose that. And when they lose it, the federal government brings in this idea, you must choose between a Catholic or a Protestant school. That First Nations have been made to take on the religions of another culture into their life for education. So my last slide here is about today, because Thunderchild is a First Nations in Alberta. Its school is Piyesiw Awasis School. And I took this off their website. We are proud to be a First Nations school that incorporates family, culture, and language in our curriculum as we assist our students embracing their identity. We practice the virtues as taught by our elders and rely on the Creator for strength and guidance in all things. So it really is a good ending. Took 100 years to get this, but it's a good ending for the people of Thunderchild. I mean, some days, and I know some of you are in this area, some days you can get pulled down, but at least for Chief Thunderchild, you look at their new school and you see it's going where he wanted that school to go way back in the early 1900s. So with that, I'll end the presentation and hope you remember Thunderchild and his desire to have one school on his reserve. Thank you very much. I can't hear you.
Oh, Heichka School.m Thunderchild. Thank you for sharing the story of the Chief Thunderchild and his community. It's been a long, hard battle, but it looks like they're striving towards reclaiming who they are. And I'm really thankful that it's a success story that we can draw on and learn from. So really thankful for you to share that with us.
Thank you.
It does a lot, reminds me a lot of different things that we are fighting for here in this school district, and how we're all coming together to embrace the cultural identity of the people in the land. And yeah, we have a lot of resilience, and we're all learning together who we are. So it's always nice to hear success stories from across, Turtle Island. And I thank you for sharing that. Aichka.
Thank you.
Really like to acknowledge UBC Press and everybody, all of our friends and relatives that help us bring forward beautiful speakers like our dear relative here, Sheila Carr-Stewart, and everybody that makes this, everybody that joins in attendance. We really hope that we are building a greater awareness in our district and far abroad. I've seen somebody from, somebody from France, I think, was on here today. People from all over, it's really lifting us up and letting us know that we are on the right path. So we thank each and every one of you, and we hope that you have a good evening. We are also grateful for the UBC Press. They're really helping us engage through their literature and providing a discount. We're using a code, TRC57. By purchasing all of these books, if you use that code, you will have a discount. So IHK UBC Press and all of our friends across the world that are helping us strive towards betterment in our little district here in the beautiful territory of Stoniwas y Stuninas. IHK. Thama Eli Nashwalakwa Tanaquail, Ita Muxquail, Nano Tala. Really thanking each and every one of you for joining us every time we host something in our district. And with our highest gratitude, we thank you for joining us here today. Ai Tapka.